for 2024, the cruise industry had $3.7 billion in revenue. But because they're growing so fast post-COVID, they're projected now to have $7.6 billion within 5 years in terms of annual revenue. So it's a rapidly growing industry, and that growth is reflected in the need and the demand for Wi-Fi.
Hey, this is Martha DeGrasse here again for the Wi-Fi Alliance, and this is our podcast, The Signal. If this is your first time listening, thank you so much for joining us. We speak with Wi-Fi industry leaders, and we try to deliver insight and perspective on the growing portfolio of Wi-Fi technologies that we see changing the connectivity landscape. And if you're already familiar with our podcast, we'd be grateful if you could rate and review on your favorite podcast app. In this episode, we are going to learn about Cisco's petition to the FCC, asking the agency to allow 6 gigahertz powered Wi-Fi on cruise ships. We're going to learn about this from Bill Davenport, Cisco's Senior Director for Connectivity and Technology, and Cisco Distinguished Engineer Matt Swartz. Welcome to The Signal, guys.
Thank you, Martha.
Thanks.
I think it would be great if you could each start with a quick intro, and then we can get a little bit more into what the petition is. Bill, do you want to go first?
Sure. Thanks, Martha. My name is Bill Davenport. I am, as you said, Senior Director for Cisco's Connectivity and Technology Policy. And I joined Cisco about 3 years ago after more than 20 years at the FCC working on wireless and spectrum and international issues. Most recently at the FCC, I was Chief of Staff to Commissioner Jeffrey Starks, where I helped establish the office and headed up his wireless and international policy issues, including Wi-Fi issues as well.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Matt?
Hi, I'm Matt Swartz. I've been at Cisco about 23 years. Had a pretty big service provider kind of routing and switching background. And then about 16 or 17 years ago, got into wireless, and then particularly made a passion out of figuring out high-density wireless, which was pretty hard to do at the time and still challenging today. And I'm in the wireless product team now and focused on all aspects of high-density wireless.
Okay, perfect. All right, Bill, can you give us an overview of this petition, what motivated it, and where it stands now?
Sure. So back in 2020, when I was actually still at the FCC authorized Wi-Fi operations in the 6 gigahertz band, which was the first time that the U.S. government had authorized new spectrum for Wi-Fi in decades, frankly. Really overdue in terms of being able to do that, as I think your listeners probably know. And in the course of doing that, however, there were it was a very complicated order, and it required a lot of protections to make sure that these new operations didn't cause interference to the folks that were already operating in the band, the incumbents. And so the FCC carved out a number of exceptions and established new limitations in those rules to protect incumbents. And one of the things that it did was that it prohibited 6 gigahertz Wi-Fi operations on boats. The thinking behind it at the time was that 6 gigahertz operations at sea or on the water could potentially cause interference to certain satellite operations having to do with water temperature sensing, which is relevant in terms of detecting storms and hurricanes and that sort of thing. So the FCC passed a blanket prohibition on Wi-Fi operations on boats, and we all moved on with our lives. Fast forward a few years to me joining Cisco, and I started hearing complaints from Matt and other people in the company saying, this doesn't make any sense. We have cruise ships that are highly dependent on Wi-Fi. We have other types of customer use cases as well. But this exception doesn't seem to make sense because cruise ships are a completely different type of entity than what the FCC had in mind when it said no boats. And so drilling down on that and talking to the stakeholders inside the company like Matt and the other people in the business, it became clear that this was a good case for reconsideration of these rules under the new administration, which has started a new proceeding that they call delete, where they are identifying rules that just don't make sense. And it's a really, I think, overdue idea. Government passes lots of rules and nobody ever goes back to look to see whether they still make sense. But this is one where it's clearly overdue for reconsideration and revision. So I've spoken to Matt and other people inside the company, and everyone supports it. And so we did our filing And we were lucky enough to get support from not only the cruise ship industry through their trade association, but also even from competitors and from the Wi-Fi Alliance as well. So it's a really, I think when you explain the proceeding to people, it seems like it gets their attention. It makes sense intuitively, and we're really confident and hopeful that this is going to move forward soon.
But cruise ships go a lot of places, and regulations around 6 gigahertz are not the same in all countries. So how does that work?
Yeah, the way that Wi-Fi regulations work is that if you're operating within the jurisdiction of a particular country, then you're subject to those rules. So, for example, if a cruise ship is in U.S. waters, then it needs to abide by U.S. Wi-Fi rules. The reality of things is that these cruise ships don't necessarily change their operations as they move around
Right.
the water. But because these cruise ships predominantly are U.S. based, or at least U.S. operations focused, they tend to follow U.S. spectrum rules.
Perfect. Okay, great. Okay, Matt, can you give us a little bit of information on why this was a priority with Cisco, both from a technical point of view and also from maybe the business opportunity point of view?
Yeah, one of the things I was actually working on one of the cruise lines with some of our customers on a new ship not all that long ago. That was really the aha moment. It was like, wait a second, because I've worked with Bill a lot, and I know about low power indoor and the building loss. I'm like, well, if a building has enough loss to be able to use this steel sided ship has even more loss. And we happen to be out in the middle of nowhere most of the time. And then the other aha moment was the idea that more and more things are happening on these ships as they get larger and larger. And so there's a lot of contention happening now where there might be shows and production and all these things. And we were there troubleshooting, and things are very resource constrained in a lot of these areas. And we're like, man, having that extra spectrum would be great. And that's kind of what kicked it off.
Is there a safety consideration as well? Does Wi-Fi help keep the ship more safe?
I would say you could say yes to that, because most of the cruise lines have crew phones that operate on Wi-Fi. So the ability for the crew to be able to communicate fast and effectively over Wi-Fi is critical. 6 gigahertz or anything that you can do to free up enough spectrum to have clean access to the medium is great.
Okay, great. And can you give us a sense of the size of these deployments? For example, how many access points would be on one of the larger cruise ships?
So the larger, more recent cruise ships that are coming out or either recently introduced are all over 4,000 access points. Some of them are getting near the 5,000 access point barrier.
And how much bandwidth is being used?
That's an interesting question. And a lot of this is wrapped into how much better the satellite internet industry has gone in itself. Multiple gigs. As of August 2025, we saw a peak of just over 4 gigabits, which is incredible for a floating city. And then a lot of that is uplink, which is very much like what we would see in our large sporting events, because in the cruise line industry, people go and take a lot of pictures and video. They get back on the ship, they hit Wi-Fi, and all of that gets synced to whichever, if you're an Apple user, an Android user, whatever, it gets synced to your cloud. So that's why the uplink tends to exceed the downlink in these scenarios.
That's interesting. How many devices do you see connected at one time?
Not uncommon to see 10 to 12,000 on these larger ships, concurrent connections.
And that probably represents maybe more than one device per person in some instances?
Yeah, because a lot of these ships, the bigger ones, are in the 7,000, mid 7,000 range for passengers, and in the mid 2,000 range for crew, which is around 10,000. But as you would expect, not everyone has got a device that's on the internet, but some people have multiple devices.
Sure. So 7,000 people on a cruise ship, and obviously multiple cruise ships at any given time are probably on the seas. Can you all give us a sense of the overall size of the cruise industry?
Well, the entire industry, I probably don't have a good guess at, but for one particular large player in the industry, I can say that they expect around 8.5 million in 2025 passengers, and they expect that to increase to close to 11 million by 2033.
Excellent. Bill, do you have anything to add here?
Yeah, Martha, to Matt's point, if that's one particular cruise line, overall cruise line expects to have almost 20 million passengers this year and is really on a path to, I think, really remarkable growth. Right now, for 2024, the cruise industry had $3.7 billion in revenue. But because they're growing so fast post-COVID, they're projected now to have $7.6 billion within 5 years in terms of annual revenue. So it's a rapidly growing industry, and that growth is reflected in the need and the demand for Wi-Fi.
Well, with 6 gigahertz, do you think that they will have better speeds and feeds, or just more people be able to connect, or what's the main benefit of 6 gigahertz?
It's along the lines of what I think that the 6 gigahertz access allows you to have lots of people, lots of devices communicating, and at the same time using applications that are very high throughput, high demand. Things like AR, VR, for example. I saw something that one cruise line has a guest experience where you can go to a restaurant and there are virtual characters on your tabletop that are interacting with your family and interacting with the food and like rolling out a carrot for your child to eat. So it's just like the bandwidth associated with that is pretty significant, and the data requirements to achieve that level of connectivity. So that's where that additional 1200 megahertz of spectrum from 6 gigahertz is really critical. If you don't have that, then it's just much more difficult, and you just can't offer those experiences.
I think the main benefit as it pertains today, because the thing is from a design perspective, the original kind of older designs, APs were placed in hallways. Most people that are really into Wi-Fi understand that's just not great. So it was a lower investment on their part to just run them right down the middle of the hallway. But the APs all hear each other really well, and they get really busy, and they don't penetrate into the cabins very well. These days, you'll see an AP in almost every cabin inside the room. So if you're in your room, I would say that that's probably not the use case for 6 gigahertz. The real use case is in those big open areas where there's a lot of people congregating. That's where we're still very resource constrained in terms of spectrum, and adding in that additional spectrum will make those areas so much better.
I think that basically everything that you can imagine doing in your home or in a business or a hotel is being carried on Wi-Fi on a cruise ship. It goes anywhere from passengers streaming their movies in their rooms, in their cabins, to the app that a lot of cruise lines use to communicate with their passengers and to make reservations to the restaurants and that sort of thing. But beyond that, we're talking about the ship itself using the Wi-Fi. I remember talking to Matt recently about how the cruise lines actually use Wi-Fi to control the lights for their theaters and sound. They use it to monitor, to the point that you were asking about, Martha. Wi-Fi actually is being used to monitor engines and facilities and security cameras. It's also being used for lots of like all the connectivity of the restaurants and the casinos. Everything basically is connected on Wi-Fi, even though it's, as Matt said, it's all through like a satellite connection that until recently was maybe not the greatest, but with improvements in technology has enabled all these new Wi-Fi uses on board these basically giant resorts on the water.
Yeah,
that's a great point.
Go ahead, Matt.
I'm sorry, but there's, Wi-Fi calling is one thing that I notice. I've taken my fair share of cruises over the years. These days, you can FaceTime or make a phone call as if you're at home on a cruise ship, which is pretty remarkable. And then, as Bill stated, a lot of things, any restaurant you go to, if you notice, there's an iPad or some sort of tablet somewhere that someone is making that reservation. And some of that traffic is, a lot of it's staying local to the ship itself. Then other things are obviously going out to the internet. I would end with saying that the cruise line industry itself, with the evolution of satellite internet, has increased their investment in the networks that go onto these ships because it works better. People are willing to pay for something that works reliably, and it's become quite a revenue stream.
What is the next steps with the petition, or when do you expect any more news on it?
Well, we have submitted it to the FCC, and it's been pending with the commission for a little while now. We've had conversations with agency staff that seem to be positive. We've also had conversations with offices on Capitol Hill, and everyone's reaction seems to be, this seems like a good idea. This makes sense. It's really just a matter of there are lots of other things that are happening in Washington and at the FCC. And so what we're really hoping to do is to encourage people who want to support this, who want better Wi-Fi on cruise ships, to contact the agency and express their support. And hopefully we'll see some progress soon.
And you mentioned that you have quite a bit of industry support in addition to the Wi-Fi Alliance. I think you mentioned that several of your competitors have already joined you.
Yes, we have another major competitor who has filed its comments in support of our filing. And then the Cruise Line Industry Association itself also filed supportive comments. I think that we have broad support for this. It just makes sense, frankly. And so we're hopefully FCC will pick this up and seek broader comment with an eye towards eventually changing the rule in the near term to allow 6 gigahertz operations on cruise ships.
Sounds likely. Are there any groups against this for any reason?
We haven't received any opposition to our proposal. Our main focus is to prove our case on why there isn't any risk of interference from Wi-Fi operations or 6 gigahertz Wi-Fi operations on board vessels. So Matt and I are currently working with a customer to conduct technical testing to show that the Wi-Fi signals inside a cruise ship don't penetrate the walls or the windows of the vessel and potentially cause interference to other operations.
All right, great. Matt, do you have anything to add here?
Yeah, only that the only way to really do that is to rent a boat and drive around a cruise ship. So we'll do that.
Yeah,
maybe a helicopter.
Sounds like you need to go on another cruise, right?
Need to go on a cruise to prove that this is safe.
All right. Okay, so if this petition becomes the rule, could it have implications for other industries that want to use 6 gigahertz Wi-Fi, particularly transportation industries? Are there other places where 6 gigahertz is not allowed that it perhaps could be, or is this sort of unique?
I would say that there are other situations like, for example, oil platforms are another area where 6 gigahertz Wi-Fi operations aren't allowed. I think that in Europe, you're allowed to have 6 gigahertz operations on trains as long as they have certain types of glass. That's something the U.S. hasn't authorized. Candidly, the FCC, as I mentioned earlier, when it adopted those rules more than 5 years ago at this point, it just didn't think through all the different use cases that are out there. And so one of the things that Cisco is focused on, and I think we have partners in this with other companies and other groups, and including the Wi-Fi Alliance, is to educate the FCC and other policymakers about all the different ways that Wi-Fi is being used by enterprises and how the FCC can update its rules to accommodate those new use cases, those different use cases, without potentially causing interference to the incumbents.
Excellent. All right, Cisco's Bill Davenport, Senior Director for Connectivity and Technology Policy, and Cisco's Distinguished Engineer Matt Swartz. Thank you so much for being here on The Signal.
Thank you, Martha.
Thanks for having us.
This was great. I hope that you can both come back sometime and tell us what happened. Okay, that is our show. Thank you so much for listening. Please don't forget to rate and subscribe on your favorite podcast app, and please join us next time for The Signal.